Welcome back to the Tale of Desperaux. Um, we left with Miggery, Sal, and Roscuro have taken the Princess P down to the dungeon, or at least we think that's where they're going. That's what Roscuro told the P that they were going to do. So let's pick up chapter 38. The strange threesome made their way down the golden stairs of the castle. The princess and Mig walked side by side, and Roscuro hid himself again in the pocket of Mig's apron, and Mig pointed to the sharp tip of the knife at the princess's back, and together they went down, down, down. The princess was led to her fate, as around her everyone slept. The king slept in his giant bed with his crown on his head and his hands crossed on his chest, dreaming that his wife, the queen, was a bird with green and gold feathers who called his name, Philip, 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 without ceasing. Cook slept in a too-small bed off the kitchen, dreaming of a recipe for soup that she could not find. "Where did I put that?" she mumbled in her sleep. "Where did that recipe go? It was for the queen's favorite soup. I must find it." And not far from Cook, in the pantry atop a bag of flour, slept the mouse Desperauex, dreaming, as you know, my friends, of knights in shining armor, of darkness and of light. In the whole of the darkened, sleeping castle there was only the light of a candle in the hand of Miggery Sal. The candle shone on the princess's dress and made it sparkle, and the princess walked tall and light, and tried not to be afraid. In this story, my friends, we have talked about the heart of the mouse, and the heart of the rat, and the heart of the serving girl Miggery Sal, but we've not talked about the heart of the princess. Like most hearts, it was complicated, shaded with dark and dappled with light. The dark thing in the princess's heart were these: a very small, very hard, burning coal of hatred for the rat who was responsible for her mother's death. And the other darkness was a tremendous sorrow, a deep sadness that her mother was dead and that the princess could now only talk to her in her dreams. And what of the light in the princess's heart? My friends, I'm pleased to tell you that the P was a kind person, and perhaps more important, she was empathetic. Do you know what it means to be empathetic? I will tell you. It means that when you are being forcibly taken to a dungeon, when you have a large knife pointed at your back, when you're trying to be brave, you are able still to think for a moment of the person who is holding that knife. You're able to think, "Oh, poor Mig, she wants to be a princess so badly, and she thinks that this is the way. Poor, poor Mig. What must it be like to want something that desperately?" That, my friends, that is empathy. And now you have a small map of the princess's heart: hatred, sorrow, kindness, empathy. The heart that she carried inside her as she went down the golden stairs and through the kitchen, and finally, just as the sky outside the castle began to lighten, down into the dark of the dungeon with the rat and the serving girl. Chapter 39. The sun rose and shed light on what Roscuro and Miggery Sal had done, and finally Desperauex awoke. But alas, he awoke too late. "I haven't seen her," Louise was shouting, "and I tell you, I'll wash my hands of her. If she's missing, I say good riddance to bad rubbish." Desperauex sat up. He looked behind him. Oh, his tail gone. Given over to the knife, and where the tail should be, nothing but a bloody stub. And more foul play. "Gregory dead?" shouted Cook. "Poor old man. That rope of his broken by who knows what, and him lost in the dark and frightened to death because of it. Oh, it's too much." "Oh, no," whispered Desperauex. "Oh, no, Gregory is dead." The mouse got to his feet and began the long climb down from the shelf. Once he was on the floor, he stuck his head around the door of the pantry and saw Cook standing in the center of the kitchen, wringing her fat hands. Beside her stood a tall woman jangling a ring of keys. "That's right," said Louise. "All the king's men was down there searching for her in the dungeon, and when they came back up, who do they have with them? They have the old man, dead. And now you tell me that Mig is missing, and I say, who cares?" Desperauex made a small noise of despair. He had slept too long. The rat had already acted. The princess was gone. Desperauex, let's see. What kind of world is it, Miss Louise, where princesses are taken from right under our noses and queens drop dead and we cannot even take comfort in soup? And with this, Cook started to cry. Shh, said Louise. I beg you, do not say that word. Soup, shouted Cook. I will say it. No one can stop me. Soup, soup, soup. And then she began to cry in earnest, wailing and sobbing. There, said Louise. She put a hand out to touch Cook, and Cook slapped it away. It will be all right, said Louise. Cook brought the hem of her apron up to wipe her tears. It won't, she said. It won't be all right ever again. They've taken our little darling away. There ain't nothing left to live for without the princess. Desperauex was amazed to have exactly what was in his heart spoken aloud by such a ferocious, mouse-hating woman as Cook. Louise again reached out to touch Cook, and this time Cook allowed her to put an arm around her shoulder. What will we do? What will we do? Wailed Cook. And Louise said, Shh, there. Alas, there was no one to comfort Desperauex, and there was no time, anyway, for him to cry. He knew what he had to do. He had to find the king. For having heard Roscuro's plan, my friends, Desperauex knew that the princess was hidden in the dungeon, and being somewhat smarter than Miggery Sow, he sensed the terrible, unspoken truth behind Roscuro's words. He knew that Mig could never be a princess, and he knew that the rat, once he captured the pea, would never let her go. And so the small mouse, who had been dipped in oil, covered in flour, and relieved of his tail, slipped out of the pantry and past the weeping ladies. He went to find the king. Chapter 40. He went first to the throne room, but the king was not there, and so Desperauex slipped through a hole in the molding and was making his way to the princess's room when he came upon the mouse council, 13 mice and one most very honored head mouse, sitting around their piece of wood debating important mouse matters. Desperauex stopped and stood very still. Fellow honored mice, said the most very honored head mouse, and then looked up from the makeshift table and saw Desperauex. Desperauex, he whispered. The other mice of the council leaned forward, straining to make sense of the word that the head mouse had just uttered. Pardon? Said another. I didn't hear right, said a third. I thought you said Desperauex. The head mouse gathered himself. He tried speaking again. Fellow members, he said, a ghost. And he raised a shaking paw and pointed at Desperauex. The other mice turned and looked. And there was Desperauex Tilling, covered in flour, looking back at them, the telltale red thread still around his neck and like a thin trail of blood. Desperauex, said Lester. Son, you've come back. Desperauex looked at his father and saw an old mouse whose fur was shot through with gray. How could that be? Desperauex had been gone only a few days, but his father had seemed to have aged many years in his absence. Son, ghost of my son, said Lester, his whispers trembling. I dream about you every night. I dream about beating that drum that sent you to your death. I was wrong. I was so wrong. No, called the most very honored head mouse. No. I've destroyed it, said Lester. I've destroyed the drum. Will you forgive me? He clasped his paws together and looked at his son. No, shouted the head mouse again. No, do not ask the ghost to forgive you, Lester. You did as you should. You did what was best for the mouse community. Lester ignored the head mouse. Son, he said, please. Desperauex looked at his father, at his gray-streaked fur and trembling whiskers, and his front paws clasped together in front of his heart, and he felt suddenly as if his own heart would break in two. His father looked so small, so sad. Forgive me, said Lester. Forgiveness, my friends, is, I think, something very much like hope and love, a powerful, wonderful thing, and a ridiculous thing, too. And here we have a picture of Desperauex standing in front of the Mouse Council. Isn't it ridiculous, after all, to think that a son could forgive his father for beating the drum that sent him to his death? Isn't it ridiculous to think that a mouse could ever forgive anyone of such perfidy? But still, here are the words Desperauex spoke to his father. He said, "I forgive you, Paul." And he said those words because he sensed that it was the only way to save his own heart, to stop it from breaking in two. Desperauex, my friend, spoke these words to save himself. And then he turned from his father and spoke to the whole mouse council. "You were wrong, all of you. You asked me to renounce my sins, and I asked you to renounce yours. You wronged me. Repent." "Never," said the head mouse. Desperauex stood before the mouse council, and he realized that he was a different mouse than he had been the last time he faced them. He'd been to the dungeon and back up out of it. He knew things that they would never know. What they thought of him, he realized, did not matter, not at all. And so, without saying another word, Desperauex turned and left the room. After he was gone, the head mouse slapped his trembling paw on the table. "Mice of the council," he said, "we have been paid a visit by a ghost who has told us to repent. We will now take a vote. All in favor of saying that this visit did not occur, vote aye." And from the members of the mouse council there came a tiny but emphatic chorus of ayes. Only one mouse said nothing. The mouse was Desperaux's father. Lester Tilling had turned his head away from the other members of the mouse council. He was trying to hide his tears. He was crying, my friends, because he had been forgiven. Chapter 41. Desperauex found the king in the pea's room, sitting on his daughter's bed, clutching the tapestry of her life to his chest. He was weeping. Although weeping really is too small a word for the activity that the king had undertaken. Tears were cascading from his eyes. A small puddle had formed at his feet. I'm not exaggerating. The king, it seemed, was intent on crying himself a river. My friends, have you ever seen a king cry? When the powerful are made weak, when they are revealed to be human, to have hearts, their diminishment is nothing short of terrifying. You can be sure that Ted Desperauex was terrified. Absolutely. But he spoke up anyway. "Sir," the mouse said to the king. But the king did not hear him, and as Desperauex watched, King Philip dropped the tapestry and took his great golden crown from his lap and used it to beat himself on the chest over and over and over again. The king, as I have already mentioned, had several faults. He was nearsighted. He made ridiculous and unreasonable, difficult to enforce laws, and, much in the way of Miggery Sow, he was not exactly the sharpest knife in the drawer. But there was one extraordinary, wonderful, admirable thing about the king. He was a man who was able and willing to love with the whole of his heart. And just as he had loved the queen with the whole of his heart, so too he loved his daughter with the whole of it. Even more than the whole, he loved the Princess P with every particle of his being, and she had been taken from him. But what Desperauex had come to say to the king had to be said, and so he tried again. "Excuse me," he said. He wasn't certain really how a mouse should address a king. "Sir." Did not seem like big enough word. Desperauex thought about it for a long moment. He cleared his throat. He spoke as loudly as he was capable. "Excuse me, most very honored head person." King Philip stopped beating his crown against his chest. He looked down. He looked around the room. "Down here, most very honored head person," said Desperauex. The king, tears still falling from his eyes, looked at the floor. He squinted. "Isn't that a bug? Is that a bug speaking to me?" he asked. "No," said Desperauex. "I am a mouse. We met once before." "A mouse?" bellowed the king. "A mouse is but one step removed from a rat." "Sir," said Desperauex, "most very honored head person, please, you have to listen to me. This is important. I know where your daughter is." "You do?" said the king. He sniffed. He blew his nose on his royal cloak. "Where?" he said as he bent over to look more closely at Desperauex. 1 tear, 2 tears, 3 enormous king-sized tears fell with an audible plop on Desperaux's head and rolled down his back, washing away the white of the flower and revealing his own brown fur. Sir, most very honored head person, sir, said Desperauex as he wiped the king's tears out of his eyes. She's in the dungeon. But no one really knows the dungeon except the rats, sir. There are thousands of places where she could be hidden, and only the rats would know. Your men would never be able to find her if the rats did not want her found. Ack! Said the king, and he clapped his hands over his ears. Do not speak to me of rats, what they know. Rats are illegal. Rats are against the law. There are no rats in my kingdom. They do not exist. Sir, most very honored head person, that is not true. Hundreds of rats live in the dungeon of this castle. One of them has taken your daughter, and if you'll send... The king started humming. I can't hear you. He stopped to shout. I cannot hear you, and anyway, what you say is wrong because you're a rodent and therefore you are a liar. He started to hum again. And then he stopped and said, I've hired fortune tellers and a magician. They're coming from a distant land. They'll tell me where my beautiful daughter is. They will speak the truth. A mouse cannot speak the truth. I'm telling you the truth, said Desperauex. I promise. But the king would not listen. He sat with his hands over his ears. He hummed loudly. Big fat tears rolled down his face and fell to the floor. Desperauex sat and stared at him in dismay. What should he do now? He put a nervous paw up to his neck and pulled at the red thread, and suddenly his dream came flooding back to him, the dark and the light and the knight swinging his sword in the terrible moment when he had realized that the suit of armor was empty. And then, my friends, as he stood before the king, a wonderful, amazing thought occurred to the mouse. What if the suit of armor had been empty for a reason? What if it had been empty because it was waiting for him? You know me. That was what the knight in his dream had said. Yes, said Desperauex out loud in wonder. I do know you. I can't hear you, sang the king. I'll have to do it myself, said the mouse. I'll be the knight in shining armor. There's no other way. It has to be me. Desperauex turned. He left the king weeping. He went to find the threadmaster. And with that, we'll stop there. Stay tuned for the next part, and we'll see if Desperauex can be the hero, the knight that he knew he was to be.